I've been looking at is that shift from being good soldiers of the old status quo to what I call brave builders of the new future that we actually want to see. Everybody's behaving as if we're still moored in port safely in the port that we've always known, when actually we're already in the middle of the ocean facing like 100-foot waves. At the core of it is we've got to stop being insistent of taking the old maps and trying to use those to be able to navigate what is now in front of us, because we are the ones who have to create new maps.
Welcome to Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host, Mike Jones, and today I'm joined by Louise Le Gat, expert in purpose-led leadership and organisational evolution. We explore what it takes to lead through system shifts, why old maps no longer work, and how leaders must upgrade their inner software to shape new futures, not just survive the old ones.
Welcome back to the Strategy Meets Reality podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Louise Le Gat. It's a pleasure to have you on the show, Louise.
Hi, very happy to be here too.
Awesome. Just for our listeners, would you be able to give a bit of background about yourself and and some context about what you've been up to lately?
Yeah. Actually, I'll start with what I've been up to lately, because I think that's the one that's much more front of mind. And one of the big pieces here is that often we think about system shifting within organizations or within the existing kind of systems and environments and ecosystems that we're actually in. And one of the pieces I've been focusing on is, but what if we are in a system shift in terms of the world itself, like the blueprint, the operating system of our economies, of literally how we think about all of that. And so if we are in the midst of that, because in some ways we are in a bit of a perfect storm, whether it's AI and what that's going to do in terms of the disruptions around that and the sustainability crisis or the upheaval of the world order, then so many things are fundamentally changing. So how do we need to evolve ourselves as leaders? Because my background is leadership. It's positive impact leadership. So I've been working in leadership for 25 years, and I've been focusing on what I call positive impact leadership, or what I then call purpose-led leadership for the last 16 years. And we are at pivotal times, and all of that needs to evolve to a very different level. So that's what I've been focusing on.
Wow, that's good. And I like that idea that, what if the system is shifting outside the organisation, what we do, and I suppose the paradigm shift that needs to take. But what do you think this means for leadership then?
So what's been interesting around leadership is we've always had, when you lead leadership development, you always have this conversation between managers, the distinction between managers or leaders. And ultimately, most people end up focusing on being managers, right? That's what we're doing. So what we've been having leadership be, it's looking at the existing results and performance and effectiveness within one system. And we have a lot of ways of being able to now ensure that. So you're learning ultimately to manage yourself, manage your team, manage your tasks. And the issue there is that most of us, even as leaders, have been trained to be what I would call good soldiers of the old status quo. So we've been taught to manage it, we've been taught to sustain it, and we've been taught, if we're honest, and especially if we're high achievers, to win at it. Because that's the game, right? You get your promotions because you're winning. It's that you're winning the competition. And when you are in the midst of that system shifting, you can't just keep focusing on business as usual, which is managing business as usual. You need to start looking beyond that. And so the piece that I've been looking at is that shift from being good soldiers of the old status quo to what I call brave builders of the new future that we actually want to see. That the core issue is, yes, it lives in that leader conversation as opposed to the manager conversation, but it has to go way beyond that so that we can become those who not just win at the status quo, but actually are able to fundamentally evolve it, because that's what we're here to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a really tough tension that you face between the status quo and the future, and is a tension that I suppose everything that's built around leaders, around the KPIs, metrics, and stuff like that, is skewed towards protecting the status quo, because that's what I'm essentially going to be chastised on, or, you know, performance managed on. That's the thing that's going to get me promoted, which then always means that bit about understanding the future, what's it mean, how do we need to fundamentally adapt, that almost takes second place, which isn't good. Definitely when the shocks come and they get hit pretty sharp, and then everybody starts to react to what's happened.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. I mean, it's lucky if it takes second place, because a lot of the parts doesn't even it's not even in existence, right?
I'm being generous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Most people are busy. They've got a list of things to do. They know what they're going to be measured on, and they're motoring through that. What I think is interesting, and I'd love actually to see what you think around that, is my current piece that I'm mulling over is that everybody's acting as if we're still in business as usual. So it's this idea that we are still in business as usual. But the reality, and the image I use is everybody's behaving as if we're still moored in port safely in the port that we've always known, when actually we're already in the middle of the ocean facing 100 feet waves. It's just that we're in this hyper normalization state of thinking, well, in my world, I'm just keeping managing what's in front of me. And we're somehow ignoring the undercurrent of fundamental disruption that is, for some of us, is arriving or has arrived, and for others, which is definitely on its way. And let's be honest, I'm not saying you suddenly stop managing what exists, right? Because you still got to maintain that. But it's also stop pretending that we're still in business as usual when we're already in the in-between system.
Yeah, you're right. And I think there's a lot there, especially with capacity. I speak to a lot of leaders, especially in the strategic space, and I look to see what they do with their time. And they spent most of the time dealing with stuff that I would call are in that operational space, where they are trying to make sure that they're delivering value as efficiently as possible. They're managing the risks of today because they've still got that value they need to give to the current external environment, as I call it. Because they're doing that, I do wonder, sort of Constantine of the organisation, they've left no capacity to understand, well, what's happening in the external environment, what's changing, what are the relationships that are now breaking down, what new relationships do we need to form, what new regulation changes are happening, all this good stuff. They don't have the capacity to do that. So this sort of, I don't know, do they ignore it? I'm not sure. Is it willful ignorance, or is it just...
I don't know. Maybe we need to ask that to people who will be listening in on that. I think there's different levels of it. In the senses, that's where the hard lives. Sometimes we've got enough hard in our everyday without adding more of the hard. But the issue with that is then we deal with the hard because it's coming anyway in a crisis context. So that's what I'm seeing leaders get hit. Like, for example, currently the for impact sector has got massively hit in terms of what's happening with the USAID. And it's, we're facing extinction level or existential level threat that we actually have to address. And none of us really saw it coming, actually. And even me in the sustainability field, because that's a big part of what I've focused on, I thought I was going to be buffered, and I wasn't. And that was a real surprise. And so...
Yeah. But again, that's why is that capacity thing. It's making that space to have those conversations a sense make, to understand what's going on. Because even in the impact for impact space, they thought that is the way that they got funding was always going to be a given. Because for so long there'd been this bank balance that was giving out all this money, and it was going to be safe. But I think that's the thing we need to get into, is the fact that nothing's ever safe, and there are early warning signs, especially when you've got Donald Trump. I always say with Donald Trump is what's the best way to explain Donald Trump? Don't take what he says factually, but take it seriously.
That's a nice one. I like that. And I think it actually comes back to one of the words that you were using a bit earlier when you were saying that everybody's focused on adding value. That the issue is that in this in-between phase, there's a real question about what do we value and what has value. in a way, for example, if you talk about the funding, you fund what you value and what you consider in your society has value. Or anyway, that's how it's meant to work. And I think that we are suddenly in the middle of this confusion about what has value, because maybe certain countries who were standing for certain values are now standing for something completely different. So what it's actually doing is it's bringing it back to us individually as leaders in terms of what is it that we actually value? What are we going to be a stand for? And you can see that, in terms of some of the areas where there's been some big changes in relation to the administration, and you've got some organizations that bow down straight away. I come from the legal sector, and I was watching Big Law with horror, to be honest. And, so immediate bowing down. And then you had actually some of the smaller firms who were the ones who were like, no, we know what our values are. We're going to stand up and we're going to beat this thing. But it's coming back down to individual leaders ultimately making choices and making decisions about what has value. But I think what we forget is that the in-between is a shaping of a new set of values. And so there's a battle going on around that, but there's no real conversation about what it is that we want to value next.
Yeah, because there is quite a seismic shift happening across the whole world. Just geopolitically, people reinstating power that they've lost or trying to establish power. You're seeing already in Africa the move for independence away from sort of any sort of foreign influence and money. But then that's just on the geopolitical side, and then we have all the technology part. And with all that is what I call not misinformation. It's just there's a lot of information, and it's hard to decipher between what's actually do we need to look at, what's actually going to be impactful, what's just noise. Because even in the AI space, there is stuff that's just, yes, need to take heed to. Some is just noise. Some is just dystopian view of stuff. So it's really hard for leaders to orientate to think about, well, what is changing? And then going, well, if that's changing, what new value space is going to emerge that we need to seize upon, or we need to be involved in to be viable.
I think it's interesting how I'd go even further in a way. It's funny. One of the pieces that I did is I worked a lot on leading change and working with leaders to help them navigate transitions, whether it's personal, but also organizational with teams, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a whole phase where I was working with people who they knew something was changing, but they didn't know what was going to change, which was a specific type of change, because normally in organizations, you're like, okay, this is where you're leaving and this is where you're going, and you might not like it, but that's where you're headed. And then let's help you come to terms and get your head around it and see what you're going to do within that context. But it was interesting because for this period, I kept getting these changes where, no, we're going to have people sit for a year not knowing what's going to happen to them. So I had views on why they couldn't do it differently, but that's a different matter. But it was a really good practice for what we're going through now, in the sense that what I'm saying to my leaders is there is a change, and the change is from had, in a way, a kind of fake certainty, but there was a level of stability. So we kind of knew what was what. But now we are in what I call the 3 U's, which is uncertainty, unknown, and unstable. That's our new reality. And so everybody's trying to go, oh, well, I want to know exactly what's going to happen. But we don't get to read the end of this book, because we're meant to read the book, to not just read the book, but write the book. And so what I'm saying to people is what we actually have to focus on is not get into a spin of what's going to happen, because lots of different things could happen based on what us as leaders, what we decide to do now. So I'm saying the real question is, what do you want to create? Because the opportunity with any system shift, and we are in the chaos of that in between. But out of chaos, if you step up as a leader, but not just a manager, but as a real leader, and what I call really focusing on that being a builder of the future, we get to shape what comes next. But we have to start asking ourselves more, not what's going to happen, because that's that reactive, passive thing, and much more, what am I going to create here? What are we going to create together? What do we want to create out of this? And that will have us actually be part of the shape-shifting, as opposed to observers or prisoners of the shape-shifting.
Yes. And I often get it when we do strategy or we do change, I always get the question from someone in the team, how do you know this is going to work, Mike? I'm like, well, I don't know if it's going to work. I'm pretty confident that we'll adapt, but that's the paradigm of that stability you're talking about, that we start here and we're going to finish here, and we know it's going to work because we've got the perfect Gantt chart that's going to tell us. Other than going, we don't know. We know what we essentially want to create in terms of, what I always use the term, what's going to be meaningfully different when the smoke clears. And it's the decisions along the way that we need to adapt. But to do that, we need sense making at the edges. That loop between observe and decide needs to be short as possible to give us that adaptation space to be able to shape. Otherwise, if we don't, we're always going to be reacting because we're waiting for permissions. And then, it's that feedback loop. So we've done this. Okay, what's happened? Where are we in relation to where we think we should be? Okay, what decisions do we need to be next?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
One of the conversations I'm having a lot with leaders, and I'll mention this, and maybe I can actually go through what I've seen, how practically or leadership does need to evolve, because there's kind of three different dynamics around that.
Yeah.
But I'll speak to one of those three dynamics, which is that so often I work with high achieving leaders, right? So they don't have a problem setting an objective and then doing their nice, either whether it's the Gantt chart or the linear plan to get there. But the piece around where we are now, and that's why I use the word create, is that we can't create the future in that nice linear ticking the boxes kind of way.
Yeah.
It's actually, and I know it's a bit strange to talk about that in terms of leadership, it's more akin to artistry and to what we know about creation and the creation process than it is that more structured linear piece, because it requires a different level of imagination. It requires, dare I say, a different level of maybe intuitive kind of following. It's a very different piece, but it also, with the leaders that I work with, it's also very exciting because what we are is we are at the edge of the known world. What we're facing is something that's uncharted. And at the core of it is we've got to stop being insistent of taking the old maps and trying to use those to be able to navigate what is now in front of us, because we are the ones who have to create new maps as opposed to enforce the old ones. And that's one aspect of the shifts that needs to happen.
Yeah. You're right, and I was on with Mark McGrath. He talks a lot about OODA loop, and this thing John Boyd always talks about was that, are you willing to destroy your own mental model to recreate something else? Yes, and that's when you think about it, it's quite a strong thing to do, but it's exactly what we're talking about here. It's, are we willing to destroy it to be open? And it's not saying that we're going to throw everything out, but it's about, are we, because there'll be some stuff that can carry on through and still be useful, but it's that ability to, map something new and be open for that. Otherwise, we're going to be carrying this dogma through and trying to force, a rectangle into a circle and thinking that it's going to work.
It's exactly that. And also, one of the things I find interesting in this context is how you have the outer system, but what most of us is we've internalized that outer system. So it's almost like we've got that mirror of the outer system as an inner system. And that's what I call our software. And so in order to create something different, we have to become aware of our software and where it's helping us literally chart these new maps and where it's holding us back. And it was interesting. Recently, I had one of my clients who was saying to me, you keep talking about a software update, like we're fixing a few bugs, but we're not tweaking stuff anymore. It's a fundamental software upgrade. She works in IT, so for her, the difference between update and upgrade was fundamental. This is a version upgrade, and it's fundamental. And it starts with giving ourselves, in terms of our inner system, that version upgrade to be able to create what comes next.
Yeah, and I use that example when I'm with leaders and I talk about, who's got an iPhone? You all got an iPhone because everyone has. But I said, why does your iPhone keep wanting to update all the time? And they're like pausing and thinking about it. I said, but just think, why is it? And eventually it gets to the point because they're saying the external environment has changed and it needs to update its software so it can operate effectively in that new environment. And I was like, yeah, exactly. And that's the same with us. Our mental models, the way we view and orientate the world, will over time come disconnected, not because we are ignorant of what's around us, because things shift. So we need to update it. We need to be willing to update our mental model so that we can stay viable, and be able to navigate this new uncertainty that we face.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I've been working on, because I feel my sense is that's where I found the gap was. And it started because I was working a lot on the sustainability side. And just in part of my experience, I teach, for example, purpose-led leadership within the context at the University of Geneva in terms of leading the sustainability transition. And I created a whole leadership track for a big incubator for scale-ups around the SDGs. And so it's always been a piece that I've wanted to really kind of be looking at. And what I've found is that the common almost mistake that we make is that we think that if we have learned like the technical expertise, that then we can automatically bring the changes that we need to. And that's where a lot of people, even before we were talking about this much more major system shift, were stumbling, because they think, oh, I know all the technical terms, whatever, or the engineering aspect, or whatever it is that they're focusing on, that's very different from how do you need to operate so that you can actually bring that. And for example, very practically, the old system is all based on competition. And so I would see people in the sustainability field like really be super competitive. And I'm like, well, just from that perspective, it means that there's going to be something that's going to be off, because you haven't even asked yourself if competition is part of the value system of sustainability. And nor have you explored that, whether you need to dismantle that within yourself. I don't have all the answers, but at least you need to start asking yourself those questions.
Yeah. You brought up some really good couple of points. That first one about needing to know the technical thing. I've had it before where, I mean, being asked to have a look at help an organization, then someone's turned around and goes, oh, well, you can't help us because you've got no experience in this field. And I'm like, well, that's probably a good thing, because I'm not taking in traditions, just like the mental model we're talking about. I could be that beautiful idiot that's going to probably look at things in a different way, different perspective, and challenge what you're doing. So I think there is this, you're perfectly right. I think there is this thing to sometimes step away and be a bit ignorant to what the system is, because that can open up a different perspective. And your second point that you brought up around, what was the second point? Oh yes, winning.
Yeah,
that's
right.
it. Sorry, I do this. Call me back when it comes. I drift off. It's like, competition. But you're exactly right, and this is the challenge I have with a lot of the orthodoxy around strategy, because it's about winning. What's your winning aspiration? How do you know we've won? Where to, they've got the where to play framework, and it's like, what's our winning aspiration? Well, if I'm selling shampoos and I'm competing for shelf space, then maybe that's a context that I'll look at. But when you think about what majority of organizations are, especially like third sector for impact, public services, all this stuff, it's not about winning.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it just throws me. But because all the MBAs classically teach these orthodoxies, most MBAs are still, and business schools are still living off of linear cause relationship. The world is stable and the world is predictable, and thus we can use these frameworks. And typically, as long as you aim for the top right corner of the two matrix, you'll be okay.
Yeah, it's funny because it feels like we've got two threads going now.
Yeah.
So one thread is that structure of our thinking. So in almost the inner system shift that we need to make now. And when you were sharing about that, it reminded me of an example of when I was a lawyer, because my first career was as a lawyer in the City of London. And this taught me just an invaluable lesson around this whole kind of thinking part and inner system. Because I'm half French, I was in an English law firm. I was a litigator, but I was advising French companies because I'm bilingual. And so my clients were sort of top French banks or top French companies. And I always remember one of the heads of a big French bank, and he called me and he said to me, Louise, I'm calling you because I want to get your advice on these French companies in France that we want to liquidate. And I was just like, has he forgotten I'm his English litigation lawyer? And I have no idea about liquidating companies in France. It's just not my area of expertise. He must have got the wrong number. And so, you're trying to appear like kind of, what you're doing. But I was just thinking, I don't think I can bluff my way through this. And so I said to him, you do know I'm your English litigation lawyer and I have no idea about kind of French liquidation law, but I'm very happy to put you through to the Paris office, who I'm sure will be able to help you. And he said, no, I'm very conscious that I've called you. I'm like, okay. He said, because I like the way you make me think. There's something in the way that we have conversations that you shift the way my mind focuses. And I need that first. And then, of course, you can put me through to your Paris office and I'll gratefully receive or pay for the actual French law advice. And I think that's the real difference between the expertise and how we think about that. And that's the bit we need to really be shifting. And then, which is connected to this point about winning, because when the game has changed, it's almost like we keep trying to win at the old game, but the game itself has changed. And so which rules are we applying? Which playbook is in operation? Because we're actually meant to create the new rules, the new playbook. And that's where in the middle of a system shift, it gets pretty strange that we're only focused on the winning.
Yes. And I think there's plenty out there's plenty out there that will tell you what to think. There's not much out there to help, about how to think about this stuff. And that's a really interesting thing about the game changing and our response to that, or lack of response, because are we willing to change? And I suppose when it comes to it, there's a lot of thing around what are we actually asking and doing, because when the game, the external environment changes quite a lot and completely different, a lot of people then start to just go back to the traditional thing about, well, what do we existentially exist for? But sometimes that, you've got to challenge that. But it's really thinking about, well, we know what we do, and it's normally about how do we then get our fit with the external environment that we need to focus on, and how do we adapt to that? And that's looking at a different way than we've done it before, fundamentally changing how we are doing things. But I don't know, it's a difficult one, because I suppose it's born out of frustration. This hence why I created the podcast, am I right? Because it's frustrating because people just still wedded to the old dogma and they're not changing.
Yes. And I think also it's very connected to what you were saying about adapting. So there's that dynamic of a bit reacting to things as opposed to this shaping and creating. And I think that's part of the fundamental shift that we have to make, which is each one of us has the power of shaping things, because the disruption is going to be so huge, actually. And that's where I see that it's really exciting. And the good soldier is not used to being in that creating, shaping phase, or that posture. Maybe if I go through some of that inner thinking around, because that might help also. I think so. What I've seen in terms of how leadership needs to evolve, it's actually going back to what I would traditionally have called self-leadership and inspirational and transformational leadership, if I was to kind of start putting in boxes. But it's like self-leadership on steroids, basically. And we need to become much more inner directed. We've ended up with leadership which is so focused on whether it's results or the boxes that we're ticking or what people are thinking of us or the promotion that we want to get. So we've got a leadership that's been very externally focused, and we need to bring it back to being inner directed. It's like, what's our inner compass and what is that saying? And then, so there's that part. And it's not about being self-obsessed. It's about being true. That's where it's connected to that thing when we talk manager and leader. Leader is much more about being true to yourself and what you're about. And a lot of us, we ended up as high achievers in that existing system. And we've created a split in terms of the things that we genuinely care about, that our own truth. Maybe it's a long time since we've even visited that place inside of us that knows what's true for us. The second part is, I call it transformational, but at the core is we've got to reconnect to our uniqueness, because how we create the new maps is it's coming back to what really makes us unique, but in terms of our true potential, not just around performance, but what is our natural flow. And when we follow that, where does ultimately our brilliance actually live? What I find is with a lot of leaders, it's almost having them come back to understanding what are survival mechanisms they learned to live and work and lead in the existing system, and what is their way of doing it in a way that I live in the Swiss mountains, so there's like the skiing on piste and the skiing off piste. And when you're skiing on piste, you just follow the piste, right? And you've got a bit your technique. When you're on piste, you're carving your own kind of path down that mountain. The different off-piste skiers will pick a different part of the mountain. They will turn at a different bump. You're carving that. And so it's a different dynamic between connecting to your own uniqueness, your own true wisdom, and then ultimately kind of bringing that out. And then that last part is what I call emergent, which is what I was talking about earlier, which is we have to be creating as opposed to simply setting linear objectives. Because if you think about shapeshifting, I don't know how you do that in the rigid structure of just my kind of set plan. Because what you're doing is you're giving an impulse, and then it's almost like the system starts to shift around that, and then you'll give it another impulse, and then it's over time. It's in a way it's more like growing a baby than it is to actually that Gantt chart. So and in some ways it's the ability to combine that. But often leaders have also lost that capability to do that. So those are the three aspects that we have to develop within ourselves. What do you think around that?
Yeah, I think you're striking a lot of things which I challenge a lot, and I do believe the first part, understanding yourself, that's crucial, because I think that unlocks a lot of the next two elements. When you come to the next two elements, and you were talking about going off piece, and this is where I challenge around this idea of alignment. And I used to talk about alignment a lot, but then I come move more towards coherence rather than alignment, because everything you look at, even when we look at culture, objectives, metrics, and they really are a centralized thing. They're saying that, and I always laugh because when I speak to a lot of HR people, they go, we want people to bring themselves to work, but as long as they mold to this. And you're thinking, well, they can't really bring themselves to work. And this brings into the old idea around freedom of action. I've always said that, and even when I was in the military with my soldiers, it's like I don't care how you achieve something as long as you achieve the outcome. And this is giving them the freedom of action. Obviously, the army is very different in probably civilian organisations. When I say that, people go, well, it could be chaos. It's not, because we have natural governing constraints for people which will mediate their choices. So I know, like I said, I don't care, like my soldier, I don't care how you achieve it, as long as you achieve it. But I do know that they will stick to the law of armed conflict. I'm pretty confident about that. We have trained them, we have given them the skills to be able to adapt to those situations, and giving them freedom of action then gives their own flair, their own style, their own perception of how they see the situation, and they can adapt to the emergence, as you were saying, as it comes along. But when we create that overly centralized structure and we take all decision rights, then there's no freedom for people to carve their own ways. And I think, and it comes further back to that technical element you were talking about, that the leaders or managers that have been in those situations, they can't divorce themselves away from, well, I wouldn't have done it that way, so it must be wrong. It's not wrong. It's just not how you would do it. And that's the uniqueness, the difference that we have as human beings. And we should do that. We should enable the right structure to allow autonomy, to give people the freedom to act.
Yeah, completely. And I think a lot of things that we end up working on with people is control, because that's a survival mechanism, actually. It's like, oh, if I'm in control, everything's going to be fine. It's kind of like, well, might be and it might not be. So it might be in a stable environment, but in a shape-shifting environment, if you're only relying on control as a survival mechanism, then good luck with that. Because the whole point is you're in the middle of things that are chaotic. And I think it was also, from what you were saying, it's that piece between in the relationship between the outer system and that inner system. And that's why when I talk about being unique, I talk about actually being transformational. Because when people say, bring yourself to work, they can bring their real self to work. What that's actually saying is, because we want them to be happy. That's where it originally came from, right?
Yes,
it's like if people get to be more themselves at work, then they are happier. The thing is that it's not looking at what actually happens when people bring themselves to work. There's also another conversation, which is which self are they bringing to work? Because if you actually want to be bringing your real self, there's quite a lot of inner work that you have to do in order to be able to access that. Most people see that as, I'm going to bring a lot of my survival maybe mechanisms to work, but it's just, wide a range. Where that's really relevant is when I have people bring their uniqueness, I'm showing them how to become transformation agents, because they tend to automatically have to become transformation agents, because the original system was actually built for controlling people. We're still in some ways in factory models. It wasn't to be creative in the factory about exactly what it was that you were doing. Not originally, even though later on those things evolved through lean, etc. But the reason I mention that is that when they say bring yourself to work, they're not buying into the potential for a system shift. They're not looking at the external system shift. And that's when it starts not working, because by having people bring themselves to work, it's actually shifting the system, because it's shifting one of the rules of the system. But then people get hammered because they are bringing themselves to work. And then they become a bit kind of uncomfortable. Their opinions are a bit inconvenient, and they might become visionaries, or they may become change agents, or they might challenge the status quo. And people haven't thought through what that means and whether that's what they really want. And so then they try and put people back into their boxes, ultimately.
Yes. And I think dissent's not a bad thing, but it's the willingness of the leader to listen to that dissent, to listen to those voices. And, at the edges of the organisation, try and understand what's going on and to see it from their perspective. I don't think a lot of leaders hide behind, I say a lot, it's just common for leaders, because they are so busy, like we talked about earlier, that they just result to looking at quantitative data that's going up rather than what's actually going on in the organisation, and not willing to listen to people. So almost people just conform to that and go, well, what's the point in saying anything? I'll just keep my head down and do what they want me to do. And I think that's a scary point. That's a really scary element. Because just thinking about if I was back in soldier mode in the army, and all my soldiers were just thinking, well, I'm just going to keep my head down, I'm not going to say anything, because what's the point? I'll be pretty scared, because I've got no one looking out for me.
Yeah.
I'm in the centre trying to give direction and look for the future. I'm really reliant on those to be my sensors, to be my eyes and ears, to give me that information. Otherwise, I'm a very vulnerable point. And I just wonder if that kind of thinking translates to organisations.
I completely agree with you. And if you go back to the metaphor of being safely in port and being out in the storm. So at one point I sailed on tall ships, and there's a real difference between when you're doing watch in port and when you're doing watch in the middle of the ocean, right? And when you're in the middle of the ocean, you need more people looking in lots of different direction. When you're in port, it's kind of like, we kind of know where we are.
Yeah.
And I think that metaphor applies, is you need everybody to be focused in a different way, because there's so much that's going on. It also relates to another aspect of what I've been working on around what I call purpose, being a purpose-led leader, and that shift from good soldier to brave builder, in the sense that it's also how you bring yourself to this. And what I've really looked at is the difference between what I call our survival mechanisms that we learnt because we were all brought up in the existing system. And whether we decided to fit in or to rebel, we're still defined a lot of actually how we function in reaction to the old system. And the bit that I underestimated for myself is how much dismantling I would actually have to do that. So I've tried to map it at least in ways that hopefully are kind of simple. And so what I see is that there's one group which is to do with you either learned to be perfect, the polarity was to rebel, and the middle bit was just to judge, whether it's yourself and others. And so that's kind of a set of behaviors, and that's maybe how we operate. But we don't realize that all those things were built in reaction to the existing system. And that's where we have to learn to anchor solidly in our real self. Like what is beyond all of those. So that's the first thing. The second piece is that there's a whole other group, which is around pleasing and that external validation part. And so we either please or we just oppose everything, and sometimes it's relevant, but it's almost these autopilots of I please or either I oppose. There's always somebody who says, oh no, that's never going to work. Never, 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 okay, all right. And then there's that middle bit, which is I'm just going to criticize. That it's still reaction to the old system and it's still not really being in your power in terms of that system. And so that's the bit where you want to be really shining in that unique brilliance. Because when you were saying bringing yourself, you don't want just that person who's only criticizing or who's only pleasing you or who's only telling you how about none of it is ever going to work or no. You want someone who's going to say, hey, I've been thinking about what you've been saying. They've actually processed it through their own brilliance, and it's like, have you thought about this? And it's taking what you're doing, what you're trying to do further. And then the last part is, and if you're looking at the world as it is, you can start to see how leaders are acting out of one of those three kind of clusters and one of those three behaviors within the clusters. Then the other one is appeasing or attacking. Or just complaining. That's kind of the other kind of cluster. And instead of actually what I call lighting the way to new horizons. So what you're really meant to be doing is, stop just appeasing or stop just attacking or stop just complaining and start really focusing on what it is we want to create next and be the one who starts to light the way that's where we need to go. And what I was trying to really do is that distinction from these reactive, internalized kind of system software that we've got and what we need to do in simple ways to start to actually shift it. Or at least the terms are simple, even though the process is probably quite a lot harder to do.
Yeah. It's like you kind of want the pessimistic optimist. That can be on board and see the possibilities, but you still want to be grounded because you have these, with that you have the dynamics of leaders. One is very much open to experience and just wants to go and move, but sometimes they need that person with them that can ground them and challenge them, go, well, what would have to be true for this to work? And then some leaders are stuck in that real safe space where they don't want to take risks, and I suppose they need someone there to challenge them and push them to take a few opportunities and risks to get moving forward. I think it's a really interesting thing about that balance that we need to try and to navigate these things. I
think part of that is also that. So I started coaching 25 years ago when I had to literally learn on the phone from the US because nobody was doing it in the UK. But the reason I mention that is, that whole area has grown massively. And at its core, if you look at what it's about, it is about having people step into a different level of self-leadership and ultimately be able to catalyze transformation within themselves and supporting others in transformation. But where it relates to what you just said is you were asking what I would call almost very good coaching questions, because all it's doing is it's having you focus in a different way. It's having you think about different things. But where I think we're going next is we need to teach people to self-coach in terms of, because we have to constantly get out of the business as usual part of our brain and start creating at least some ecosystems in our own mind that are starting to focus on how the game is changing and how we choose to shape that and how we stop the autopilot. One of the other things I'm working with some people is also how we need to create maybe some, well, almost definitely ecosystems of the future, which have a different culture internally, which are much more intrapreneurial, where you've got different value systems within the organization. Because what's happening is you've got a lot of big organizations stuck in operational excellence. And the weird thing is that once we're in the middle of the ocean, your operational excellence was based on being safely in port. In the middle of the ocean, you need to have somewhere where you've got almost back at the beginning, you need some startup modes. And what I'm seeing a lot of the big organizations is actually sack their innovators, their change managements, their visionaries, because they're basically focusing on optimizing efficiency. And those are the ones that are kind of the misfits that don't fit neatly. When actually, ironically, those misfits are the ones who often have the right reflexes to be able to sail in the middle of that storm, and they have the potential to lead in the middle of that storm because they think outside of that box. So it's also an interesting piece around how you build that within your own mind, these bubbles almost, and then how you build these bubbles within organizations and then activate the right people to be able, and in the right way, to be able to help you chart your course across.
Yeah. And it's right, it's come back to that thing around navigating today versus tomorrow, but also a constant tension that organizations struggle with is efficiency versus agility. It's all about efficiency. And it's like, we need to cut costs. They'll get in one of the big four, and the big four will just go through and go, let's just strip money here and here. There's no context. There's no it's like, for instance, an organization that they were going through something and they had one of the big four come through, and the big four said, we need to cut heads. So what do you mean cut heads? Well, we need to reduce our spending, so we're going to reduce heads. Yeah, but what heads and for why? And they couldn't. It was a case of we're just going to cut people. Well, no. What value are you trying to achieve? And then let's look at it that way. And we worked out that we didn't cut any heads, but we made them savings by looking at the structure in which the organisation was operating. And I said, we've got to look beyond the traditional thing about efficiency. We cut costs, cut people, because then we don't lose that agility. And as we're saying, with the outside world being so uncertain and unstable and unknown, that we need that agility to be able to adapt to the situation. Hopefully we maintain viability. And that operational excellence thing you were talking about blows my mind, because and I get it, we do need an element of it, which is all this ISO stuff, like ISO 27001, ISO blah blah blah. It's all the excellence, and I get it. At the core, they are good things because they provide a level of coherent structure if they're used right. But I just see consistently that people don't use them for what they should be. They use them as they just tick box. We've done this, so if we've ticked these boxes, we've done that, and it becomes performative. It's like KPRs and OKRs; they become performative rather than maintaining that look about outcome. What outcome are we actually trying to achieve? And then we can adapt with that. Yeah, there's my rant. Anyway, does that make sense?
It completely makes sense. There's lots of different pieces on that, and I think so. One of the pieces that you were saying that was really resonating, it's that reflex to just cut everything. And let's be honest, I know sometimes you do have to, but it's become the answer to everything. When for me, it's not about cutting, it's reinventing. That's actually what we need to do. We need to be able to reinvent. What I found during this period, and I'm on a much sort of smaller level, but before all of this, I think for me, before COVID, I had a pretty stable business. I knew who my clients were, I knew what my products were, and that was it, right? And it'd been working nicely and well for a period. Since 2020, it's been a ride. But why it's been a ride is that because maybe also my business is so connected to where people are at in their heads. And if you think about what keeps happening, you have COVID, then you have the war in Ukraine, then you have, and all these different things that we've been through. And every time it's like this spin that kind of happens. And it took me a while to understand that what was happening to me is I had to keep going back to startup mode because people were in a different place. And what I'm seeing is that's also what organizations need to understand. They almost need to have a kind of reinvention, fast reinvention, which connects to that agility part, to be able to keep navigating and then actually restructuring. Because maybe things, as you said, need to be restructured. They definitely need to, but how can you do that fast? And how can you know your people so well that you can deploy them in different ways? And as I said, on top of that, who are you sacking? Because if you're sacking all your innovators because they ask difficult questions, well, maybe they're the ones you need to keep on board, because maybe they'll have different answers, which is also what you need. My little rant is also, especially with AI, I'm like, so what? We're just gonna, and I know, we don't really know what's gonna happen, but there's this whole thing of, oh, we're gonna cut and cut people. And I'm like, are we? Because
Yeah.
for me, there's always this correlation between employees and customers. Like, you have employees, they get paid, and then they go buy stuff. And I see people so often complain to me, oh, nobody's buying anything. And I'm like, well, everybody's sacking everybody. So it's kind of normal, because they're not separate people. Yeah. They are human beings. So what happens if you sack everybody because you cut for efficiency and then nobody has cash to buy anything, and then you keep cutting? I mean, so that's not going to work. What we have to do is that shaping and that reinventing on that.
Yeah, you're totally right. And, AI is I don't think a lot of companies did do that, and they've started to retract now and bring back employees that they sack because of what AI could do their job. But AI is useful to free up the capacity of your employees. So I always try to tell people AI is an effect. It is not a person, it's an effect. And actually, you can use it effectively to free up the capacity of your people to get more from them. There's something that you can't get from AI, but it just means that your employees have got more time and capacity to do the stuff that we've been talking about all episode, rather than filling in the spreadsheet. It's something like that, I think. But yeah, I think there's a lot to get our heads around, or leaders to get their heads around, organizations to get their heads around this new world, this new paradigm, and be willing to dismantle probably what has helped them quite graciously up till now. But they need to know that, yes, that had its time and place. It doesn't mean it wasn't effective. It's just not got fit with where we're going now. So we need to find a way to get fit. And I've absolutely loved this conversation, Louise. Is there anything that you would like to leave our listeners to think about from this podcast?
Well, there's just one piece that, in terms of what you just said, that I did want to kind of mirror back, if that's okay, is I think that the conversation where it's shifting now is actually what has value and how do we add value? Because often what we have is people in organizations, they kind of feel like they're just doing their job, and we're not asking those questions anymore around what has value now, because in this world, what has value is actually shape-shifting. And what I also say to people is, remember, we're building the plane as we fly it. So we're getting to define what has value now. And so what I would say as leaders is we have to be brave and step up at a completely different level around being willing to shape the conversation around what has value. And then the other part of our job is to ultimately activate our people around how do they think in this value add kind of way, because that gives you that, what I'd call entrepreneurial agility. That, when you were talking about when you were in the military and they had your back, that's how we all have our backs, because everybody then is looking at what are we doing in terms of actual value add. And how am I contributing to that? Which takes things to a completely different level. But in order to do that, we have to stop. If I just do the be perfect, please, and appease, that's just not going to give you that, because that's not what that system was designed for. So as the system shapeshifts, we have to shapeshift our own software to be able to contribute that being solidly in ourselves, that unique brilliance, and really being able to start lighting new possibilities and create. Literally, we get to be the generation that is creating stuff that has never ever been thought of at a completely different level than we've had before. So it's time to stick our head above the parapet and get going with that. And And lastly, there's going to be what I also think is exciting is that there's about to be a generational shift on boards. I'm 52, and it's like Gen X is up now. And so my final message is to Gen Xers. We have an opportunity here to make a difference by stepping to that completely different of legacy leadership and not just keep doing the same old. So there's an opportunity here, but we have to really choose to grab it.
Yeah, I think that's good. I like that. And it really resonates, that point. It really aligns with what you were talking about earlier around this shape instead of constantly reacting to what's going on. That's awesome. Thank you. I really love the conversation, Louise, and I'll put your details if people want to reach out to you for a further conversation. But yeah, I think there's a lot to go away and think about there. I've written some notes that I'm going to go explore and think about. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the conversation too. Really great. We changed the world today.
Awesome.
Hopefully.
Exactly. Yeah. And I look forward to meeting you in person at the SIO conference in the 3rd and 4th of September.
I've been leading a session on the inner system shifts. So yeah, that's a good place to continue the conversation.
Awesome. And so I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much, Louise. I'll speak to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.